Hey guys, how's it going? Coach Weston here with Good Lift Performance. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you guys about what do you do if you have a bad session. Bad sessions can happen once in a while. Obviously, we try to do everything in our power to control our context, our recovery, our training so that we can always have good training, right? But it's never going to always be great. There's usually going to be hiccups in the road. There's going to be some downturns, right? Things are sometimes not going to go according to plan. And so having the understanding of that can happen and trying to figure out why that happened and how we can go from that bad session and moving forward is really, really important in powerlifting, right? Because we don't want one bad session to turn into multiple bad sessions. So first, understanding why we had that bad session or a bad performance is really, really important. And so what do we mean by having a bad session? Normally, it's going to be either we missed a rep, right, or we failed a set, or it's going to be that a weight that should have been a much lower RPE or much easier is way harder on the day, right? Those are generally the two hallmarks of a bad session. If there's anything else that you guys experience that makes it feel like a bad session that I didn't just mention, let me know down in the comments. Those are the two main ones I could think of. And so when we have that bad session, right, when our expected performance doesn't match our actual performance, where we think that we should have been able to do better, but we didn't, we have to try to understand why that happened. So the first place to start looking is your recovery. How has your nutrition been? How has your sleep been? How is your stress? Those are the big three that you need to look at. With nutrition, are you getting in your protein? Are you getting in your total calories? Not just within that day, but within the past 24 hours. If you had a big session yesterday, didn't eat very well, but now you're eating better today, that could still throw you off because you could still be in an energy deficit from yesterday if you didn't finish your calories, right? Or if you're not eating enough protein and you're eating a lot of carbs and fat, yes, you might have the fuel to work out, but you're not recovering because you don't have enough protein, and so that could throw off your recovery, right? Sleep is another big one. Usually with sleep, acute sleep loss isn't as big of an issue. It's more of like if it's a chronic, and when I say chronic, I mean like multiple days, not just like a month worth of sleep loss, but like if you have a couple days of not good sleep, that's when it starts catching up to you versus just one bad night of sleep. Usually doesn't, in my experience, doesn't usually affect lifters too much, but still sleep is important. How is our overall quality of sleep? And then stress. Is there anything stressful going on in our life that's affecting our energy, right? Like did you get in a fight with your significant other? Is there something really stressful going on at work? Stress is the silent killer, where it may not feel initially that it's affecting you, but it can actually really blunt performance. Everyone processes stress a little bit differently, right? So things that might be minor and not stressful to one person could be very stressful to another person. And so it's just, is there something that is taking you away, both mentally or draining your energy mentally or taking away your focus, right? So how is your stress? How is your nutrition? How is your sleep? Those are the first three things that you should look at when assessing if you had a bad day. One or more of those is not in check. That's usually an easy fix of, hey, I need to get on these. I need to cross my T's, dot my I's when it comes to recovery, and then get back on the program. That's usually the number one thing, right? So that's our first checklist is recovery. Now let's assume that everything recovery-wise is good to go. But we still had a bad performance. Well, what could it be? The next thing to look at is where are we within our program? Now, let's say you had a really hard session prior in the week, or let's say it's at the end of last week and now it's the beginning of the next week. Within the past couple of days, did you have a hard session within the past couple of days? If yes, that fatigue from that session might be bleeding into your recovery and you might be having a down performance, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially once you get to know your recovery patterns. If you can expect that, hey, I have a really big training session on Friday and I know coming in Monday I'm going to be fatigued or whatever that may be. And so understanding your recovery patterns is very, very important there. Or like if you overshot, for example, let's say on the session before that you accidentally overshot that session, now your next session may have a downturn in performance. And so even though let's say the session before, right, even that overshoot, let's say that was a big PR and that was great, like that wasn't a bad session, right? But we overshot really fatigued ourselves, but we hit a big PR. We have that big swing in one direction, and now we're probably gonna have a swing in the opposite direction, and you're gonna come down off that high, and you're gonna have a fatigue present in that next session or next couple of sessions, right? You kind of have to pay back that fatigue debt that you used to have that big session prior. So understanding not just recovery, but also in terms of outside context, but also training recovery of where you are in the program, what you had done previously to get up to this point. It also could be where you're in let's say you're like in a volume block, right? You're doing lots of volume and you're getting towards the end of your program and you're just starting to feel a little beat up, right? In that case, that can totally happen where fatigue is just starting to catch up to you and it just got a little bit high. And a lot of times those are harder to predict, right? Where it's on any given day that coin could have flipped either way of whether you're going to have a good session or a bad session. And usually in those cases, it's not like you're having a terrible session. It's normally just you just feel a little bit run down. You're not able to do as much as expected, but it's usually not a terrible session, right? And so understanding, have we built up a lot of fatigue from lots of good training and now it's just we need to recover from that? Or is it you had one really big session and you have to recover from that? So previous training. In those cases, it's a good idea to just, once again, focus on recovery, but usually it's pulling now instead of focusing on your nutrition and your sleep, because those should be in check. Now it's focusing on pulling back and training to allow for recovery. So reducing that weight or dropping some sets or dropping some reps will allow you to recover. Usually the best way to go about that is dropping the weight so you can still hit your volume, your sets and reps, and then just move on, right? And that's why it's useful to use RP in those scenarios, because then you're allowed to drop, you can adjust the weight to match the RP you need on that day. And so basically just recovering from the previous training. Another one would be, this one's a lot more common, is at the end of a peak, right? As we're going into competition, where we're really trying to push your body to its limit. When you are peaking for competition, it's not uncommon, especially in the last week or two, to miss a lift, right? Especially when they're going to be 9 RPE, 10 RPE lifts. When you're pushing your body to that limit, sometimes when you're kind of riding that limit, right? You're riding close to the sun, and sometimes you get too close to the sun and you burn. In those cases, it's important to understand that usually that's a fatigue built up. As long as you are picking reasonable numbers and strategic numbers, that even if you miss it, that it's most likely just a buildup of fatigue that once you taper, you'll be good to go. That's kind of where the saying like trust the taper comes from, right? Where we build up fatigue over the prep and then we try to taper it off so we can have this great performance, right? Where we try to really push your fitness as high as we can, knowing that fatigue will also rise really high, and then we can drop off fatigue the last second and try to maintain that fitness higher. We push those higher than we normally would so that when we drop off the fatigue, the fitness should stay higher relative. And so that's definitely can be tricky, right? To perfectly get that down. You can get it right 3 out of 4 times, and maybe that 4th time something happened to where that excess fatigue got built up, right? And a lot of times in those situations, like you don't even know exactly the specific reason it happened. You just know it happened. And so in those cases, just trusting the taper is the biggest thing, of knowing, hey, like we know the strength is there, especially if it's like last week you hit X weight and then you only go up like 5 or 10 keys and it should 100% be there and just isn't on the day. That's usually, it's just fatigue, right? And so once you taper, it should, assuming you have a good taper and a good program, that should show up on meet day or your test day or whatever, like your next week, right? That happens a lot at the end of preps, where, especially on like deadlift, because that's the most fatiguing one. A lot of times lifters will miss their last deadlift in prep and then they go smash it that or more on the platform. They'll hit that or more on the platform. And so really it's, in that scenario, is understanding, once again, kind of related to the ones prior, is it fatigue? But this is more of like specifically really close to prep versus in the middle of a random training cycle, right? Now, let's say that all your nutrition is in check, right? All your recovery is in check, both training and nutrition, and you still had a bad day. Like all the stars aligned for you to have a good session, and you have no idea why you had a bad session. Sometimes you just have a bad session. Like I've seen that both in myself and some of my lectures, where it's like stars were aligned and it just wasn't there on the day. It's super random. And there's also been times where, we just talked about nutrition and sleep. There's times where you can come off really terrible nutrition and sleep and have a great session. It's like your body's super compensating. But then when you actually get all the stars aligned, your body like relaxes, and then it like just your performance just drops off, right? So if that's the case, that's usually just a one-off. Like there's times where, you go in and it's like you forgot how to lift. You're like, wow, technique feels really foreign today, which it normally never does on this session. And so if you have a very established recovery pattern of this is how I usually feel on this day, and then you just feel off on that day randomly, chances are that's a one-off session and you don't need to think too much about or put too much weight into it until that becomes a trend. So you can usually just put that behind you and forget about it. Because sometimes it just randomly you have an off session. Maybe it's from a lack of focus or there's something else going on. Might be a lot of times that's stress, honestly, because stress is kind of that silent killer that people don't realize that even if something you're good, you feel like you're good at handling stress. Sometimes things can sneak in there when you don't expect it and can affect you. So a lot of times that it's like a random acute spike in stress I've seen. So there's lots of different scenarios where you might have a bad session that you might be able to identify why, or you can't identify it, right? And so overall, like the big thing to understand is that it's just one session, right? So if it's a random, you have no idea why you did bad on that day, don't put too much stock into it. A lot of athletes will have one bad session and think that they've regressed, or think that this is their, like they align their self-worth, both performance and as a human being, with how they do every single session. And we have to break away from that and understand there's going to be ebbs and flow in training, and that one bad session does not define you. As long as you get back on the horse and make adjustments, then we're good to go. So one session, that's, one, even if you just look at it a month, right? Let's say you train 4 days a week. There's 4 weeks in a month. So that's going to be 16 sessions. 1 out of 16, if you have one session out of 16 that's bad, that's barely anything, right? And that's just a month, right? That's not even 10%. And so you're still getting an A for that month worth of training. So you can think about it like that, where it's such a small drop in the puddle that it's not going to make a big difference at the end. Something one of my early coaches taught me was that a lot of things are going to come out in the wash, right? So as long as you're doing most of the things right most of the time and doing the best of your ability to control those things, it's going to turn out all right in the end. So understanding to not catastrophize when things don't go your way on one particular session is really, really important, because if we do allow ourselves to spiral after one session, that one bad session can lead to multiple bad sessions, right? Where if you go, oh, I had a bad session, now I have to prove myself on the next session, push even harder. Now you're just digging that recovery deficit even more, right? Because if it's in the context of we're in the middle of a training cycle, right? Or you just hit a big PR like the week prior, or a big set that really fatigued you, you are in a fatigue deficit that you now need to recover from. You have more fatigue than was planned at this point. And so it's important that if you try to keep pushing hard because you have to try to prove yourself, or whatever reason that may be, now you're just digging that hole deeper and deeper, right? Versus we want to go the opposite way. We want to climb out of the hole. So that's when we have to start recovering. So that's when it's important to take some weight off the bar or reduce some of the working sets. If you have a coach, letting your coach know, right? Not just hiding it. Don't be ashamed that you had a bad performance. Let them know, because if it's something in the program that they can control, they should be able to change it, right? Versus if it's something on your end, you can still let them know, but say, hey, this is what happened, and here's how this is probably why it happened. It's my fault. I can do these things to make it better next time, right? So taking responsibility for that, of highlighting the reason why it didn't go well. Making sure that you don't let that one bad session turn into multiple bad sessions is really, really important, because in those other contexts where it's, hey, you just had a really big PR, or you're doing a ton of volume, right, and you're now fatigued, the reasons for why you're having a bad session are positive, right? Like you're either doing the work that's going to make you stronger and you just need to recover, or you had an expression of strength that showed that you just made a progress and now you need to recover from that, right? So the bad session isn't because you're doing something wrong necessarily, especially if it's your recovery is checked off, right? Nutrition, sleep, and stress. It's because we're doing good work and training, and we just need to allow your body to recover, right? We need to manually facilitate that with your training. And so a lot of times, even though it's a negative experience, it's because of positive reasons, right? As long as it's outside of the recovery factors that we can control. So understanding that is really, really important. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you have had a bad session and didn't know what to do, long story short, identify why it was a bad session, put that bad session behind you and move on, making adjustments if needed, right? So let me know if you guys have any questions. If you're interested in coaching, make sure to hit that link down below to apply for coaching. Use the link. There's also a link in the description to buy the merch if you're interested in buying some Good Lift Performance apparel. I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.